covers college sports and NIL for the Washington Post. We welcome Jesse Dougherty onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Jesse.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming on to the show. Really appreciate it. Our coverage as of late has been focusing on college sports. Such an interesting time, especially with just the NCAA tournament, and particularly women college basketball. And I want to start there before we hop into some other issues concerning just the college sports realm, specifically college basketball. And I read a recent article of yours just discussing comparing the men's tournament and the women's tournament, just in terms of how much money each of those just different tournaments go. And you mentioned that the women's sports schools still get $0 for their women's team participating and advancing in the NCAA tournament. Can you explain why is this the case and explain how that works and what is the future, since this has been, I would say, one of the most successful NCAA tournaments for the women's game in quite a while for women's college basketball?
Yeah. So as of now, on the men's side of the tournament, there are performance units. And what that means is for every game a team participates in, they earn one unit, which this year was valued at $2 million for their conference. So let's say UConn plays 6 games. That's $12 million, 6 units, $2 million each for going all the way. So each game you participate in is money back for your conference, distributed to the schools. On the women's side, that $2 million is zero as of now. So there is actually no financial reward for, let's say, South Carolina or Iowa or any other school for participating and or advancing in the tournament. That is supposed to change by next year. The NCAA and Charlie Baker, its president, have said that they expect to kick a plan into place by next spring that would bring a units program to women's basketball. But you're totally right, Justin. It's just such a transcendent and transformative time for the women's game. And these changes, I mean, getting the marquee games on ABC, bringing a performance unit program to that bracket, they're overdue, but it makes sense that we're seeing it now because it's so visible and some of the inequities are so laid bare because of how much excitement is being generated. I mean, look, like, you know, the women's final drew more viewers than the men's final, and that's the Caitlin Clark bump for sure. But you have to think even without her, it would be a lot closer than usual. So certainly having a moment, but a lot of folks I've talked to on that side of the bracket would say moments are quick. They'd like to turn it into something a bit longer.
I want to ask you with the women's game real quick. I think it's fascinating, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like most recently, in terms of the Caitlin Clark effect, I think, at least in terms of my radar, kind of started with Sabrina Ionescu in terms of that increased popularity into women's college basketball, and particularly social media. Just hearing about these players in high school, kind of that effect that we're seeing in the men's game on social media when they're in high school, spreading to the women's game. They already have buzz, and by the time they get into college, they already have a huge fan base. Do you think that's a factor in just the women's game growing as well, in terms of, hey, they got that buzz coming out of high school, that anticipation kind of already begins to swell when they're a freshman, and by the time they're near upperclassman status, that's when you kind of see that boom happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think a differentiator, at least. I mean, look, it's impossible to have these discussions and not compare men's and women's game because they always function sort of in relation to each other, right? At least to a degree. So I think a major factor too is what the transfer portal has meant on each side. So on the men's side, if you're an elite player, you're probably going to the draft pretty quickly. After that, it's hard to find a star level player who either stays for 4 years because of the pros or stays at one school for 4 years because of the portal and the opportunity to go elsewhere, to make NIL money, to draw up a bidding war in the portal, to win a championship potentially, all those things. We're starting to see the portal have more of an effect on the women's side, but until this year, it didn't really. I mean, you could sort of name the really, really high level transfers. You could count them on one hand. Angel Reese went from Maryland to LSU. Haley Van Lith last year went from Louisville to LSU. But, you know, it's Paige Beckers. She doesn't have the option to be a one and done. So she's going to stay at UConn and see it through. Caitlin Clark couldn't be a one and done, and she's not transferring from Iowa. So I think also, like, from an identity standpoint and a buzz standpoint, when you stay 3 years or 4 years in one place, you're just naturally going to get more famous, and people are going to know you where you are, and you're going to develop around other players. And we sort of know Caitlin Clark in relation to Kate Martin and Gabby Marshall, and we know Angel Reese in relation to Flau'jae Johnson. Like, the men's side doesn't really have that right now. I mean, UConn, they go back-to-back championships. They lost 3 starters last year and had to replace them with guys in the portal and freshmen. So it's the turnovers, and that's not an argument for or against the portal. I mean, I think the player movement is largely positive, and the effects on the game, are maybe worse for the schools, but maybe better for the product. There's generates more buzz year round. I mean, we're talking about it at this moment, which typically in college sports, the offseason didn't generate that kind of buzz, like maybe a professional league does. But I think until this year, we've probably seen a more active portal than ever on the women's side, and some big names. Like I'm thinking of Kiki Iriafen from Stanford's in the portal, and Haley Van Lith is going to go to her 3rd school, and there's some really big time players. But until this point, they've really developed where they were, and I think that matters a lot, and I think that has really elevated the game. It's so star driven on the women's side right now, so you can't divorce that from the fact that they're staying on in their programs and developing there and becoming stars on their campuses.
Jesse, wanted to ask, you mentioned where the games were broadcasted between the men's championship and the women's championship. Yeah. And certainly it almost seems like maybe an inversion to what it's been in the past in terms of, for I think most people, the men's game being a little less accessible in that finals compared to, the women's championship game being on ABC. Do you think there's any sort of, I don't even know how to put it, maybe like a buyer's remorse, or I know regardless, it's a win for NCAA that both finals got great ratings, but do you think there's any concerns with the men's side of things that they weren't able to draw as high of a rating, and that maybe people are missing out on them from not being on, network TV like ABC?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't consider myself sort of a media rights expert. I don't know what like a sort of consistent backslide, even if it's incremental, on the men's tournament viewings would mean for like a next TV contract. I have to think, and again, I'm sort of going above my pay grade here. I have to think that tournament will always sell itself. I don't really think it matters if it's Zach Edey or Cam Spencer or whoever it was 5 years ago, or whoever it is 5 years from now. The men's March Madness tournament is just such a fabric of American sports culture and society in March and April. I mean, it's synonymous with one of the 12 months. There's not any sporting events really that are like that. So I think that if you're the NCAA and you're looking at these numbers, I don't know if you're as invested necessarily year to year, if you're emotionally swinging with the men's tournament for that reason. I think it's just so embedded. The women's tournament, I think you're really going to be keyed up next year, because if you don't get close to those numbers, then it's the Caitlin Clark effect, right? And a lot of people who for years maybe were against putting those games on ABC, or were in your social media mentions, whether it's Peter 7775892 bot egg emoji, whatever. Like that person now has a reason to say that was a flash in the pan. That wasn't real. That wasn't actual progress. It was stunted by this generational once in a million talent. So I think that's going to be really telling. And they're locked into a deal with ESPN now for the next 8 years. So it's not like that's kind of consequential either on the women's side in terms of an immediate sort of, there's not going to be a restructuring of that. Frankly, you could argue ESPN got a really good deal out from the NCAA because of these ratings we saw. But I just think the men's tournament, I think it's a really good point, and something maybe I want to chew on a bit more, but I just have to think that product sells itself.
So I want to shift gears, and I want to talk about NIL, and I wanted to see from your perspective in regards to the negatives. Are there any actual concrete negatives about NIL on the effect on college sports? Because the arguments I have heard just seems to be more just a generational thing, kind of like a get off my lawn type of thing. And I haven't seen anything that's truly negative about the effect of NIL in terms of players actually making money off of their name and likeness. Can you kind of lay that out, or do you think a lot of the negatives are kind of overblown and they don't have any merit?
Yeah, I mean, I could think of a couple. I mean, I think the pure transaction of athletes making money from either collectives or brands, I don't find there to be many negatives. And of course, there are one-off situations everywhere, right? There are outliers. But overall, I think that is a net positive. I think, frankly, the NCAA and the schools should be counting their blessings that this is sort of getting them off the hook, at least for now, to actually pay the athletes, right? Like it's a half measure because there's no revenue sharing of TV money. There's no actual payments from schools to athletes. So a lot of collectives are doing that work for them. I don't know how sustainable that is, but for right now, it's a really actually a good situation for the schools, as much as they might want to hem and haw about it publicly. Some of the negatives, I mean, I think the player movement stuff, like, I don't think transferring's bad. I think 4 schools in 4 years maybe isn't great. And I think the market it's created, like there are no contracts. And now there's a whole other discussion of employment and revenue sharing, but like players in pro leagues don't go to 4 teams in 4 years unless you're kind of let's say in basketball, unless you're kind of an end of the bench role player. Like if you're a star, you sign a contract. So you make money off, the money you're generating and you get your annual cut and it's guaranteed and it's not tethered to charity events or appearances or autograph sessions. It's tethered to actually playing the sport. And you stick around, and that's good. I think that's good for the product. Like whether it's Joel Embiid or Giannis or whoever it may be. And like I guess you could make the argument like Kevin Durant and James Harden have kind of broken that mold in recent years. But like generally, it's good that good players are at least somewhere for a bit. Rivalries develop, storylines develop, all those things that I think drive interest. So I think for the product overall, that's not great. The other thing is, and I wrote about this back in December. There's relatively no guidance or enforcement or even rules in some cases of who can represent these athletes. And I think that's really thorny. Look, like, do I think everyone has to have a law degree to be an agent necessarily? I don't know. I think that's a kind of a tough barrier for entry, especially when there's so much supply that's sort of outpacing the demand. The demand is outpacing the supply of agents, right? So your friend in your chemistry class now is your agent because you're a third string linebacker at Notre Dame, and all you want to do is sign a contract with the pizza shop down the street, right? I don't think that's bad. I think when we're talking about like big money and there's adults poaching kids and Instagram DMing them and saying, look, hey, you want to go into the portal? Like, let's get you some money. I put in that story. I'll tell you, like, there's a player at NC State who was contacted by someone who said, let's transfer out of here and get you some money in the portal. And someone on campus that was kind of doing compliance and helping the players work through this looked up the person. He was a Time Warner cable rep, not even in the state.
Wow.
And I mean, our headline was kind of like a quip, but it was like, you're an NIL agent if you want to be, right? Like Matt, just let's start our agency. We can do it now. So we can just start negotiating deals. So that's not the only example of that sort of thing. Like, I think the term guardrails is really used by administrators and ADs as like a way to say like, this is the Wild West and we need to stop paying these kids so much money. So I'm not going to say guardrails, but I do think there could be some rules in place that could not only, help the athletes, but just help the overall health of the market. And the agent piece is one that really stands out to me.
So Jesse, do you see, I mean, you mentioned earlier, like some of the benefits of having contracts and things like that. And with NIL basically being in its infancy, are there things like that, like safeguards or restrictions you see this moving towards, since it was kind of rolled out very quickly? I mean, it kind of felt like we just like waved the flags and everyone was off to the races with this NIL business. Do you see kind of more restrictions coming as we see, I don't know, maybe the consequences of it, or just maybe some of those cons that are sort of built into how it's structured at the moment?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're seeing is, and this is a cliche for a reason, that it's really hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. So I think like, I don't know, absent of some sort of employment model with revenue athletes, how the NCAA would put parameters and guardrails on this market and not run afoul with antitrust law. And I feel like, so I started this job in October and I should have gotten a law degree because I feel like every day it's a new legal term or trial or something. But yeah, so I think that's becoming really apparent. I mean, the NCAA is like 0 for 100 in court recently. It's just like it cannot win. So that's a major factor. And then the employment question is interesting. Like if you went into a college athletics department And like, I don't know if you're Harry Potter fans at all, but like employment is like Voldemort. Like you can't, like, it's just like, you can't say that, right? Like that's the word you can't say. And look, like the argument is generally economic. At least that's what they'll make. There's just not enough money, right? Like especially schools that don't turn a huge profit, or they're not in conferences that have these big TV deals. Like we just don't have. I've heard it estimated pretty repeatedly, and I haven't done this math or looked into it a ton, but maybe somewhere between $15 and $20 million to pay minimum wage or something around it to a bulk of your athletes, right? That's it's not obviously cheap. For some schools it might seem that way, but for others it's not. So then you start to get into like, which schools will this apply to? Is it a power conference thing? Is it a football thing? Is it only football, basketball, women's basketball? All but to me, as much as administrators and the powers that be want to avoid that and even avoid the conversation, you have to think that a lot of what they want, players not leaving school every year, players playing in bowl games for football, when you saw that Florida State team all sit out because of the NFL draft, you can put that in contracts. You can actually negotiate this and collectively bargain this. You just need to call the athletes what they are, and basically it's professional athletes. So there might be things on the other end that you don't want or you don't get. That's why it's collectively bargained. There's some give, some take. But I do think a lot of what these administrators say they want could be bargained for. And that's not to say, I haven't sort of scaled out how it would look across the country and across conferences. I'm not saying it's the solution, but in some specific isolated cases, employment and contracts and some sort of collective bargaining does feel like the way to get what these actual administrators want. I don't think they would admit that. But I also think they probably should be preparing for it, because it feels like that's the way the tide is moving.
Is it too risky for them to do that if they go down that rabbit hole? Because ultimately they feel like they might have to pay the athletes like a larger wage. Is that's why they're hesitant towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, that's with NIL. Again, this is just fake numbers, but let's say the top 5% of athletes really make significant money. Now, if you're paying minimum wage to 85 scholarship football players, that's all coming out of either the university or conference budget, and you have to spread it out to everyone. It's not just the quarterback and the receiver and the wide receiver, whoever running back and star cornerback. It's a whole roster now. So that's a much different economic equation, right? It might not be the $2 million we're told the top basketball player or football player gets from a collective, but you're now spreading it across a much larger population. Now there's Title IX concerns. Do you have to give the same opportunities for minimum wage slots and positions to female athletes as male athletes? Now you're paying the women's soccer team because it balances out with the football roster. Those are just, there's a million questions. It's just because the system has operated so long without that. So that means that all these complications that have been created are decades in the making, because without these kind of solutions, without any sort of NIL, without any sort of discussion of not discussion, but any sort of movement on employment or revenue sharing, it all has to happen at once, with sort of a ticking clock with some of these massive lawsuits we haven't even talked about, which are sort of make your brain melt. But yeah, I mean, I guess to answer your question, yes, the fear, if you're someone who wants your school to either not lose money or hoard more money from athletes, is that you'd have to pay more athletes more money.
Jesse, is there something that you see, like with the research and reporting that you do, and also just with the general opinions, is there something that you see as kind of like the most regular or reoccurring misconception regarding NIL? Like, do you feel like NIL is well understood by the public?
It's a really, really good question. I would probably say a misconception is how many athletes are making money and how much it is. And and that's another thing too, is like, there is no data, which is another crazy element of the whole NIL market. There just is no data, publicly, right? For me, for you, for schools, really. I mean, there's some data sharing that goes on. That's kind of a whole convoluted thing, but really it's like, if you're a linebacker and go into the portal and you're like, well, LSU offered me $800,000, like it's hard to really know. There's no market value for these things. Like, if you're in baseball and you're a fourth starter and you say, the Yankees offered me $10 million, the Nationals can look at it and say, they did? Good luck. Because they know what four starters get. It's and this thing is changing year by year. There's no way to. So I think in some ways, like, there probably would shock some people what some players do make. It could be some random one-off bidding wars for an offensive tackle who was a mid-major sensation, who went into the portal, had 7 power conference schools, bid on his services with collective money, and now he's making close to 7 figures. Like, that might shock you. But I don't think, like, everyone's driving around campus with a Lamborghini. And I do think, like, that can be the way, you listen to the congressional hearings or you sit in on them like I have in recent months. And that's kind of the picture they want to paint. Is that it's just run amok and everyone is just totally rich. And I think there's a lot of athletes doing really well. I think in the revenue sports, there's a demand for them. I think there's things like, I think football players have leveraged the NFL draft and said, to keep me on campus, I need to make X, Y, and Z. So I do think there is a lot of it does favor the athlete, but I think people might just assume that, everyone you see on TV now is like as rich as a professional athlete. And that's just not the case.
So you mentioned that opponents of NIL, I think that they probably want to keep the integrity of being a student athlete.
Right.
And I feel that's pretty ridiculous because with coaches, they can make, an insane amount of money. They have the freedom to have their contracts bought out and go somewhere else. Matt and I were alumni of University of Mexico. That's happened with the coach, Steve Alford. He went to UCLA once he established University of Mexico. He's able to leave. But it's very taboo now for players just to exercise the rights just to go into the transfer portal or make more money. And it seems like it's a generational clash with coaches in terms of just how they feel about NIL and the transfer portal. Is that where I'm seeing it, or do they actually have some actual concrete concerns about kind of this new era of just college sports overall?
Yeah, I think their fault line probably is generational to a degree. And just to sort of underscore how sort of silly and sort of irrational the term student athlete has become. There's chemistry students in the Big Ten don't fly from LA to Rutgers for a Tuesday morning lab, but volleyball players are about to do that this year because of realignment. So it's just, it's so professionalized, and everything about it is professionalized. You can't bring a water bottle into an NCAA arena during a game. You have to pour it into an NCAA sponsored cup, and it's like, wow. So these are not just like mom and pop club sports. So, but when the NCAA wants to treat it that way, or when schools do, it's only when in the argument's convenient. So, I think it's generational. I think it also probably is sort of in line with sort of where you fall, sort of with feelings about general labor. If you work in higher education, you probably have a certain different viewpoint than if you're just an everyday sports fan who wants to see your team hoard the best talent from the transfer portal. So it's, it probably depends where you are in the world too. But yeah, I have found, if I think about it, or at least just tonally, the emails I get of people who are angry, they sound older. I don't want to be ageist and say that everyone is. I know plenty of older people who are progressive on these issues too, but it does feel pretty generational.
In terms of, we saw comments towards the very end of the season from Gino Auriemma of the UConn Huskies, who did very well in the tournament, of course. In terms of retaining talent and things like that, is there a certain, I guess, reality with it being harder to retain players and keep them focused on the team? Or is this just something where, hey, coaches have to adapt to the new times just like the players are?
Yeah, I think what's unrealistic is coaching, recruiting high schoolers, recruiting the portal, and retaining your roster. I think Brad Underwood said it during the tournament. Like he's preparing to play the biggest game of his team's season, and he's made 10 phone calls in the hallway with guys in the portal. And that's also a function of the schedule, right? Like the NCAA has not done these teams any favors with opening the portal up during the tournament or during tournament season. And the same goes for football too. It's just I understand that players need to sort of get on campuses, and you can't do it in April necessarily. But I mean, then again, we're fooling ourselves that the sort of class is more important than football or basketball. And I get it's thorny with graduating and whatnot, but it's just not the reality right now. But yeah, so I think that the player retention's almost a full-time job. You've heard so many coaches say that, like, when do I actually get to the whiteboard or the clipboard to draw up a play? I need to spend time recruiting my own roster back before I can even think about high school classes. The COVID year and the medical red shirts have complicated that too, just because most of the rosters are really old. And frankly, we saw with Kentucky, like, old wins now. I think that used to be sort of the mid-major secret, was to bring these older rosters into the tournament. Now almost everyone has older rosters. But yeah, I mean, I get, if you're a coach, why you think it's unrealistic to juggle all these things. I think a total free market with total freedom of movement without a ton of data on what players are earning is very athlete friendly. One could argue it's been such a long time coming that finally, right, it's athlete friendly. I mean, I've covered Major League Baseball for 5 years, and this sort of version of free agency that the NCAA has is way more friendly to the athlete than professional sports. You're really locked into a team when you're playing Major League Baseball and have to really grind out, 6 years, 10 years sometimes before reaching a free agency and being able to choose your destination. So yeah, I get it. Like, I think like you've both pointed out, like, years of ADs and coaches and assistants and everyone moving around as they choose, and now the athletes do it and everyone wants to clutch their pearls. It's kind of cringy and feels like it's not really, doesn't really all add up. But if my job and my livelihood and everything hinges on me putting out the best product, I'd be frustrated with the system. I mean, it'd be hard not to, because it does feel like it works against you, and it creates a ton of extra work, and it takes away from the things maybe you're used to doing or want to be doing more of. So I get it. I think, the cream rises to the top, and, like, it didn't hurt UConn, right? And then other schools are going to come back year after year and do it again too. So that's how I feel about that.
Jesse, same question to you that I asked about NIL earlier, but with the transfer portal, again, something that just all of a sudden it felt like one day it's not here, one day it's here. The transfer portal is wide open. Do you see any sort of putting some of that toothpaste back into, the toothpaste roll?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes back to the conversation about does the NCAA and these conferences and these schools, do they want, or are they forced to treat athletes like employees? I mean, I think, again, if athletes ultimately want to be employees, and it's not blanket, everyone does or everyone doesn't. I think there's probably a million opinions on a super gray spectrum about that across the country. Male, female athletes, revenue, non-revenue, big conference, small conference, etc. But if, let's say for the sake of this argument, that every athlete wanted to be an employee, and they won that fight, they get it. They reach employment status. They are either employees of their conferences or their schools or some combination of both, and they collectively bargain. Bargaining units don't always win everything they want. So if you want, double minimum wage, the NCAA and its its lawyers might come back and say, okay, great. Well, we want you to be only to play the one college. And now those players go back to their lawyers and they say, oh man, one school for 4 years? I don't know. Okay, let's ask for minimum wage only, but 2 schools, right? So now they're bargaining. So you lost double minimum wage. You're down to minimum wage, but instead of being able to one school for 4 years, now you're at 2. So you can transfer once. So now we're not seeing 3 to 4 schools in 4 years. We're seeing 2. The athletes get paid. So that's how that would work. So either the NCAA is going to get forced into that in some degree, or there's going to be some hybrid. I don't know. But I think that's how the toothpaste in that regard gets back in the tube. I don't see it really happening with NIL, because even if it goes in-house, as it looks increasingly it's going to happen, where schools can strike deals with athletes, they can facilitate brand deals, they can pay them directly through some NIL contract and licensing deals. I don't know how you restrict collectives, especially because they've been allowed to act as charitable organizations, for a couple of years now. So that's the toothpaste on the NIL side is a little bit harder. The complete and total freedom of movement, I think, actually would be one of the first things, if I'm on the NCAA side, that I would try and get back. And once you're bargaining for labor law within collective bargaining, if that's in a contract, the antitrust lawyers cannot come back and sue you. You have protection from that because you negotiated that, and it's part of this contract. So that's how I think. So I think if you ask me which, we're going to just go with the toothpaste thing. If you ask me which toothpaste is going to go back or could go back, to me, it's the portal being such a constant. I think there will always be players transferring, but seeing three schools in 3 years, and these coaches have to constantly recruiting their rosters, I think they'll have more assurance in the future of who will be there next fall, if there is some sort of collective bargaining down the line.
Jesse, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you on social media, and then where they can find your work and any other projects you're working on as well?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking, and this has been great. On social media, I'm at Dougherty_Jesse. So my last name and first name backwards with an underscore in between, on both X and Threads, and then WashingtonPost.com/sports. Hopefully, if I have a story on there that day, it's on that website. It's high up enough on the homepage where you find it if you go to that. But yeah, that's where we are, and not just me, but all my colleagues cover college sports too, and do a great job. So that's where you can find us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jesse. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.